And good afternoon. This is Gloria Nelson with TUG, and it's our pleasure to have you join us this afternoon for Janelle's presentation on rocking your presentation. And before we get started, I'd like to do a quick plug for TUG. If you have not yet made your reservations at the hotel, please, if you did not sign up for the all-inclusive registration, please do so quickly, because the hotel is not only tight because of our program, but has 2 other additional programs that will be vying for any additional space. So we want to make sure that you are under the roof of the conference hotel, and if you haven't done that yet, please do so. On our first day, Monday, March 9th, at our general session, Nick Tassler is going to be the keynote presenter. He's an internationally acclaimed thought leader, organizational psychologist, and #1 best-selling author of 4, count them 4, counterintuitive science books on the art and science of making decisions and leading change. And on Tuesday, March 10th, we're very excited because the new Infor CEO, Kevin Samuelson, is going to be sharing the changes coming from Infor, and also we'll be hearing from Kelly Squazzaro, who is Infor's Director of Industry and Solution Strategy on changes and distributions in the distribution industry. So be sure that you make those hotel reservations without any further delay, because we want to see you all at TUG Connects. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to do a quick screen switch, and I'm going to give Janelle power of the controls. But before I do that, I would like to share some information and do a brief introduction for Janelle. As I introduce her on today's webinar, let me begin with a few questions. #1, have you ever sat through a boring presentation? 2, and couldn't leave because you were in need of the content? Do you sometimes give presentations and want to avoid mistakes you've seen others make? Are you a seasoned presenter who could stand to learn a few tips? And if you answered yes to any of these questions, you're going to be glad that you're here today. Our speaker holds a PhD in organizational communication from Purdue University. She's been a manager in a startup company, a college professor, a director in a global organization, and has been helping technical professionals communicate effectively for as long as she can remember. She lives with her husband and 3 children, a self-proclaimed foodie who enjoys reverse engineering recipes for dishes from her favorite restaurants. Helping you rock your technical presentation, please join me in welcoming from chilly, and I mean chilly, Minneapolis, speaker, trainer, and user interface designer in a past life, Dr. Janelle Anderson. Janelle, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much, Gloria. It is chilly here in Minneapolis, although we are having kind of a balmy day. It's almost 32 degrees. And I love that you gave Nick Tassler a plug. He is also from Minneapolis and somebody that I know, because us speakers kind of tend to hang out together. So you are in for a real treat when Nick presents. So let's get into it. So by the end of the webinar today, you will know the following things. You'll be able to select an organizational structure for your presentation. You will know how to structure and design evidence to support what you're up to in your presentation. You're going to have some new tools for engaging your audience. You will be better at managing your nervousness, for those of you who get nervous, which is probably most speakers. You'll know how to facilitate the question and answer sessions effectively, and you will know what to do after the presentation is over, because sometimes it feels like once we're done, but there are actually other things to attend to after your presentation is over. So we'll address those as well. So I'm structuring my presentation today with under the constructs of before the presentation, during the presentation, and after the presentation. So let's dive right into before. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about structure, designing evidence, and managing the nervousness. And yes, I want to talk about managing the nervousness as something you need to do before the presentation begins, and that will help you during the presentation. Now, before I dive into a whole lot of content here, I'm going to put up a quick poll, and the poll question is coming. Should be seen on your screen here in just a second. Let's see. The poll is open, and the poll, if you don't see the poll, go ahead and take a look for it. The question is: are you scheduled to present at TUG Connects this year?
Those results are still tabulating here. Can you see them, Janelle, on your end, or would you like me to?
I can see them starting to come in. And let's see, the poll's been open for, let's see, about 20 seconds here. Let's give it another 3 seconds and then I will close the poll. So if you haven't voted yet and you plan to vote, go ahead and vote because the poll is going to close in 3, 2, and oh, they're still coming in. So I'm going to hold on one more second. Let's see. We've got 83% of the people who voted so far. Okay, now I'm really going to close it in 3, 2, 1, closing. All right. So the poll is closed and now I'm going to share the results. And let's see. So attendees should be able to view the poll results right now. It looks like 29% of you who are on the call who voted are yes, you are presenting at TUG Connects this year, and 71% are here because this is great content that you'll be able to use anytime you're giving a technical presentation, not just at TUG Connects. So I'm glad to see that many of you are here for your own professional development, regardless of whether you're presenting at TUG. I'm now going to go ahead and hide those poll results. And Gloria, are we back to my presentation? Let's see, Gloria, I can't hear you, but I'm hoping that we're back to my presentation.
We are, Janelle.
Okay, great. All right, so let's dive into before. I want you to be thinking about what's the purpose of your presentation. Are you informing people about something? Are you trying to persuade them to, say, use a particular feature in the software or use features maybe a little bit differently than they've been thinking about? Are you presenting a strategy or an action plan for them to follow? Or are you giving them very concrete and specific how-to steps to perform a task? And so we're going to explore each of these 4 items in a little bit more depth to give you some things to think about if you are doing one of these things, and then specifically some tips for each one of them, how you might execute a little bit better on each one of them. All right, so we're going to start with informing. So will you be teaching or explaining a new concept? Will you be updating the audience's existing knowledge base? Or will you be describing a technical concept? The more you get clear on if you're doing one of these things, then it's very likely that you are informing your audience of something. And if you are informing, here are a few specific tips that can help in the structure of your presentation to make sure that you actually hit those goals, that goal of informing. So you want to think about building on audience's prior knowledge. How much do they already know about what you're going to be sharing with them, and how much is new information? Be really clear and specific as you explain your ideas so that they can follow along. Because if you're informing, chances are they may have some prior knowledge, but they don't know they don't know as much as you do. So you need to explain that information clearly and provide adequate background material. In the world of adult learning, we call this scaffolding. So if you can build that scaffolding for them so that they can, and that's their background material, so that they can put this new material on top of the background material, or sometimes even the material that they already know, then it's very helpful and easier for them to understand the new ideas that you're bringing up. Be careful about using technical jargon, and you want to know your audience. So for example, one of the things that we just did to get to know the audience is to ask you a poll question. So you might use some of those same techniques in person to kind of find out how many of you are already using this feature but want to know how to go deeper in using this feature or use some of the advanced parts of this feature by show of hands. And then you can just look around the room and see who knows. And then you want to make sure the audience is with you and stays with you as you go along. So part of your job as a presenter is also to be listening, and even listening with your eyes, watching the audience, so that if you see looks of confusion and you see that they're not following, then that's a good time to stop and ask if they have any questions, or to back up and maybe share a little bit more detailed information. Then one other thing is just make sure that your enthusiasm about the topic comes through. Whether, if you're presenting at TUG, there's a really good chance that you were enthusiastic about the topic that you submitted, or perhaps you were tapped to share what you know out with the group. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes you get asked to present on something because you are the house expert or the resident expert in it, and you might not always feel that enthusiastic either about the topic or about presenting. So make sure that enthusiasm, sometimes you have to channel that enthusiasm from another place. The second thing you might be doing is persuading or convincing. And so if you are persuading or convincing, think about these questions. Will you be convincing the audience to take action? Will you be promoting a particular viewpoint? Will you be suggesting an approach to a problem and trying to convince them to use your solution to that problem? So if you're doing one of these three things, there's a really good chance that you are persuading or convincing, and that is what you're up to in the purpose of your presentation. So here's a few things to think about, a few tips for when you're persuading or convincing. Understand all sides of the issue, because people are going to have competing viewpoints when you're persuading, and the more well-versed you are in all sides of the issue, the more likely you are to be convincing in suggesting that one approach is better than the others. Again, you want to provide sufficient background material so people understand why you're advocating for one course of action or one way of doing things over another. Construct your argument very carefully, because again, people are going to have different viewpoints. You want to make sure that you are aware of those viewpoints and that you have structured your argument in a way that people can follow in order to be persuaded. You're going to want to use solid, credible evidence, because you don't want the people who have alternate viewpoints to be poking holes in your argument or the path that you're laying out. And you want to address those counter arguments. And the more you can say, hey, I know some of you may be used to doing it this way, or some of you might think that way is the better way to do it. Well, I'm here to tell you that that's a valid way, but my way is even just a little bit better. And then be prepared for those other viewpoints to show up in the Q&A period. And we'll be talking specifically and giving you some tips about the Q&A period here in a few minutes. One thing, a third thing that you might be doing is presenting a strategy or an action plan. And if you're doing that, you might be making a proposal. You might be offering a solution to a technical problem. So some of you, if you're presenting at TUG Connects, you might be offering, say, a workaround to a feature that isn't there in the software that you're advocating to for be added to the software, but in the meantime, you have found, a workaround. Or you might also be offering a solution to an organizational problem, and sometimes that's a technical talk as well. So if you are doing any of those things, here's a few tips that can make that strategy or action plan presentation go a little bit better. Follow a problem solution format, because when people clearly see the problem laid out and articulated, it's much easier for them to get their head around the solution that you're proposing and make that feel like a valid solution. Provide adequate background material like we talked about in some of the other ones, just to really make sure that people have that scaffolding so that your new strategy or action plan fits, fits what they know. Address reasons why other solutions may not work. And so here this is a bit persuasive as well. And also be open to new ideas, because as you lay out your strategy or action plan, people in the audience might have thought about that same situation differently, and they might be sharing their ideas as well. And then include a clear and direct call to action so that people know how to take that information that you've just shared and actually put that strategy or that action plan into place and actually make something happen. And finally, and I figure there's a number of you who are going to be explaining how to perform a task. So if you're explaining how to perform a task, you might be specifically training somebody on how to do something, or you might be giving a product demonstration. Now, when you're explaining or showing how to perform a task, there's a couple of considerations to make. First, you want to consider their level of prior knowledge. Are they expert? Are they novice? Are they somewhere in between? And again, just in terms of finding out where people are at in your audience, you might ask them, how many of you are expert at doing this? How many of you are novice at doing this, by show of hands? And to demonstrate that in the webinar format, I'm going to ask you another poll question. And so here I will be sharing another poll question, and you should see it coming up on the screen. I'm launching it right now. Do you consider yourself an inexperienced presenter, a somewhat experienced presenter, or a very experienced presenter? Now, I'm asking you this poll question because I want to see who I have in my audience, much in the same way that when you're giving a technical presentation, you're going to want to see who's in your audience. And so, again, if you're doing this in a live format, you might be asking, hey, by show of hands, how many of you consider yourself to be a somewhat inexperienced presenter? And then let those hands be up for a while, and then say, okay, great. Now, how many of you consider yourself a somewhat experienced presenter, and so on? And you let those hands go up, and on it goes. Now, I see that we've got 89% of the people who have voted already, so I think that's a pretty good number. So I'm going to go ahead and close that poll and share the results with you. So you will see, you should be seeing the results from that poll being shared right now. 40% of you identified yourselves as an inexperienced presenter, 45% a somewhat experienced presenter, and 15% experienced presenter. So fantastic. So again, it helps me know who I've got in my audience, and it's going to help you know who's in your audience as well. I'm going to go ahead and hide those poll results now and go back to the regularly scheduled programming here. All right, so consider their level of prior knowledge. Find out if they're expert or novice. Another thing that you would want to do in this setting is include screenshots or possibly a live demonstration. And since we're talking software, and I know many of you know this, but doing a live demonstration with software has some risks. And so think about whether or not the live demonstration is the only way to do it, because it might be that a series of screenshots could be just as effective without having the risks of a live presentation. If it really does need to be live, you might also want to consider doing a screen capture video in advance and then inserting that video into your PowerPoint deck so that, again, there are no surprises in your presentation. If you absolutely must do a live demonstration in your presentation, make sure you are that you're very ready to take a couple of deep breaths and reset if things don't go as planned, because whether it's an internet failure or the data isn't acting as you expected it would, or any number of things, that can really throw you, and you just want to make sure that you can carry on and get through the rest of your presentation if something goes wrong. And then finally, not quite finally, we got one more after this. Don't overload the audience with too many steps. We're going to talk in a few minutes about it. It is great to go step by step, but if there's 37 steps, that can get really overwhelming for the audience to follow along and stay engaged. And then make those steps easy to follow. So those are some tips for when you are explaining how to perform a task. Now, in all presentations, here are a few high-level things to consider. The first is begin with a strong introduction. And sometimes that introduction might be a question. How many of you struggle with invoices? Or how many of you struggle with your warehouse staff not keeping your inventory management system up to date, or something like that is related to your content that's going to get people either nodding, or you might even say, hey, by show of hands. And then you're going to get people putting that hand up in the air. And whether it's a question or a story or an anecdote that might be amusing, but has, absolutely related to your content, maybe a time when something went wrong, those kinds of things really capture people's attention right at the beginning. And if you don't have them right at the beginning, it's really hard to pull them back partway through the presentation. Be well organized in your presentation, because if you've got a structure, so for example, today we've got before, during, and after, if people do lose track of what's happening in the presentation, they get distracted by their smartphone or something else, then they can more easily kind of link back in with the presentation if it's well organized, because they can figure out where you're at if they've drifted off. Use effective visual communication. So if you've got images on slides, make sure that content is effective and dynamic and the kinds of thing that's going to keep their attention throughout. And then you want to close with a strong conclusion. Again, that might be a call to action. It might be a review of a step-by-step approach. Any number of things could be that strong conclusion, but make sure you've planned some time for your conclusion. Now, before we go ahead with the next step, there's something that I really want to underscore as deeply as I can, and that is that when you sit down to plan your presentation and to start your presentation, I do not want you to open PowerPoint or whatever your presentation software of choice is. Do not start with that. I want you to start with thinking about, what is it that I'm up to here? Am I informing? Am I persuading? Am I setting out a strategy or an action plan? Or am I demonstrating something with a how-to presentation? Get really clear on what you're doing, and then I'd like you to go back to your good old-fashioned 7th grade English class where they taught you to do an outline on a piece of paper, and it could be the back of an envelope while you're on an airplane or on the train on the way to work or whatever, but sketch out on a piece of paper roughly what you are thinking of doing in that presentation before you go to software. And the reason for that is otherwise your presentation will be designed by PowerPoint rather than being designed by you, because PowerPoint is going to prompt you to put a bunch of bullet points on a page, and we want you to make a more visually effective presentation than what PowerPoint might naturally guide you to do. So we want you to be in control of that and not PowerPoint. And that actually brings us really nicely into the next thing you want to do before the presentation, and that is design compelling evidence. So let's say you've got a screenshot that you're using, and I would imagine in a technical presentation, many of you are going to be using lots of screenshots, but there might be a particular thing within that screenshot that you want to hone people's attention on. And so then you can use things like boxes. So here I've got a red box around a particular area of the screenshot that I want people to focus their attention on. And then what I've done in this next image is I've just cropped that whole screenshot down to just that one section, invoices by status, and now we're going to blow that section up. So I just cropped that and added a little animation and made that bigger. So now you're going to, if you were going to then discuss something about looking at and analyzing your invoices by status, then you could go through this and say what you needed to say about this, but you've honed people's attention on one part of the screen. Because if we left that whole screenshot up, people's attention will tend to wander, and they'll be looking at all of the screenshot, not just the part that you want to talk about. So make use of some of the animations within PowerPoint to design that compelling evidence, so you can do, kind of zooming in on things or whatever thing it is that you want to emphasize. And the next thing related to designing effective slides is, especially if you are doing a presentation that is a how-to, a step-by-step thing, show instead of tell. So here's just how to simply tie a necktie, but this image just does a great job of showing step by step by step. Now, in many cases, you might have multiple screens that you're stepping people through, so it's not all going to fit on one screen. You might have 9 steps, and much like this image does, with the numbers called out in circles and the arrows, the more you can use circles, numbers, arrows, things like that to specifically point people's attention to one area of the process or a direction something flows, that's going to be incredibly helpful for them in terms of their being able to go back to the office and repeat the steps that you showed them. If you're just simply telling them, first you go here, then you go here, then you go here, it's much less likely that they are going to have a lasting comprehension of what you shared. So if you can call out these things, again, step by step, and show them how to do it rather than simply telling them how to do it. The third and final thing I want to cover before the presentation is managing your nervousness. And yes, managing your nervousness absolutely starts well before your presentation. So I want to give you several tips that you can do before the presentation that will help you manage your nervousness in the moment. The first is just practice, practice, practice. If you have not gone through your slides and spoken your presentation out loud, you are not ready. Practice more than you need to practice. Work into casual conversations with your colleagues, things about your presentation, and practice little snippets of it here and there. You might even gather a group of well-meaning colleagues who would be a good audience for you to give it a test run and practice in front of them. The second tip is to visualize success. If you've ever screwed something up in a presentation, you might have that story stuck in your head. Oh yeah, that time I totally bombed. And if you keep imagining and replaying the mental tape of you bombing or of you not being successful, that is going to get in the way of you giving a successful presentation, because your brain is going to think that that's what it's supposed to do. So you want to visualize that success, much like professional athletes do in the world of sports. So Michael Jordan, the basketball great, at the heyday of his success, he was spending about 4 or 5 hours on the court with his teammates on non-game days practicing, but then he was spending another 4 to 5 hours visualizing success. So he's doing actual visualizations. Some of that was also watching game tapes, replaying games and past games and so on. But he wasn't visualizing himself running down the court and then missing the layup. He was visualizing himself running down the court and hitting that layup every single time. So you want to spend some time also visualizing yourself be successful. I'm a big fan of having a pregame ritual. Do something that pumps you up and gets you in the space to present. When I'm presenting, I have a song I listen to, so I plug in my headset about 10, 15 minutes before my presentation, and I listen to that song on my smartphone, and that helps get me in the moment. And then when you are presenting, make sure that you do look people in the eye, because that reminds you that these are human beings and they really have your best interests at heart. And that actually kind of leads to the final thing here. Remember this: the audience wants to see you succeed. And think about your own experience as an audience member. Have you ever sat down in a chair to listen to a presentation and think, man, I hope this presenter bombs. It would be great to see this go, totally off the rails. No, we don't do that. We sit down thinking like, this should be some really good content. I'm excited to be here and I hope this is great. So that's what they're thinking. They want to see you succeed. They want great information out of you. So those things should help you manage your nervousness so that when you get in the moment and you are during your presentation, you won't be quite so nervous, and you're managing it if you are. All right, now we're going to move on to the second part of the presentation here, and we're going to look at during the presentation. What are some things that you should be doing during the presentation that will make that presentation go better? So the very first one is we want you to relax. We do not want you looking like this guy, because if you are looking like this guy, you are all tense, you're nervous, and you feel like you're going to bomb. So instead, you want to relax, look at your audience members, smile at them. Remember that they're human. They put their pants on one leg at a time, just like you do. And I did say, look at your audience members. We do not want you looking at the screen. We want you to make eye contact with the audience. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second, but interact with your audience early and often, because the more you're interacting with them, the more engaged they stay, the better questions they're going to ask, and the more actionable content they're going to be able to take from your technical presentation. A third thing that you'll do is, the third thing that you can do and probably should do, is set expectations and ground rules. And I'll give you an example of what some of those expectations and ground rules might be, specifically if you were talking, if you're giving a technical presentation at the at TUG Connects this year. So what not to do? Okay, do not look up at the screen. So we're going to put a big X on this. We don't want you looking up at the screen. You will have your computer there, have your computer either in presenter mode, where you can see the current slide and what's coming next. And if you're not familiar on how to do that, that's right within the in the tab on PowerPoint or your presentation software of choice, where you're going to start the presentation from. Look for the little box that says presenter mode, check that box, and then on your monitor, you'll see the current slide plus what's coming next. That's a great way to stay with the presentation and manage your transitions between points or between screens. Another thing that you can do is have a printout, just a quick thumbnail printout of each of your slides with you, just in case that presenter mode isn't working, because you want to be looking either at your computer, which should be in front of you and towards the audience, or specifically looking at the audience if you don't need to be looking at the screen. I mentioned interacting with your audience. You want to interact with your audience early and often. So what the research on adult learners tells us is that adult learners will participate more if they participate early. So even something as simple as asking a question, like I mentioned before, how many of you have tried this and been frustrated with it? And ask people to raise their hand, just like in the picture here, because when you get them to interact, even by raising their hand, or something where they don't have to, in fact, speak out loud, they are going to be much more likely to stay engaged throughout. So here's a few other things that you can do. You can tell a story, or an anecdote. You can provide an example of, again, sometimes it's fun to provide an example of how things didn't work until you followed the steps that you're about to share with them, and then it did work. So those examples are great ways and compelling ways to start a presentation. And then in terms of engaging your audience throughout, if you can use the word you more than you use the word I or we, so you will find that when you are on step 2 of this process, you will see such and such come up on the screen. Instead of talking about your own experience, talk about what their experience will be when they're following your steps, or when they're repeating the process, or when they're enacting this strategy or action plan, because that's going to make them feel that the presentation is really more about them than it is about you, because you do want to give an audience-centered presentation. Now, with something like presenting at TUG Connects, you may want to set out some ground rules. Now, this goes for any technical presentation, but specifically, these might be some ones you would want to use at TUG Connects. And in fact, Gloria went through some housekeeping at the top of the call, and that's the same kind of thing that we're talking about when we're talking about ground rules. So you'd want to hear a sample ground rule might be ensure that your phone is on vibrate or silence, and feel free to take notes on your phone, tweet, etc. We just don't want we don't want your phone ringing, and we don't want you actually answering calls during the technical presentation. Number 2, feel free to share your concerns, but keep it civil so that we can have a productive discussion, because we know that not everybody's going to think the same about the topics that you're presenting on. Specifically for TUG Connects, you might say, we won't spend more than 7 minutes on any given topic, so that we can keep the agenda moving and that we can make sure that we get through all of the content that we know you came to hear in the session today. Another thing that you might do is say, again, for a TUG Connects presentation, when you have a question, please state your name, your company, and which version of the ERP you're using, just because that's going to help people orient, and also help the speaker, yourself, orient to the question. And then finally, don't monopolize the discussion. Let others participate. We want to make sure that lots of people get their questions answered, and so on. So when you put out those ground rules, it really does help your audience set their expectations for how they are going to interact with you. And again, I know Gloria did tell you, you could go ahead and type any questions that you have into that question bank, and she will shout them out to me when they show up. So if you do have any, go ahead and put them in there, because then I would have a better chance of demonstrating for you some of the ways that you can facilitate a Q&A. So the first one is reinforce the ground rules. So if you've said you want to hold questions to the end and people are jumping up with wanting to ask questions, then you might say, as I mentioned, we are holding questions till the end. Now, I do have to make a little caveat here. If you are giving a technical presentation, people are going to have questions as you go along. And if you don't answer those questions in context, like as they come up, but rather ask people to hold those questions to the end, then they might not be able to follow the information that came after the point they had a question. Because if they're so stuck on something, perhaps their comprehension of that isn't where it needs to be in order to understand the rest of your presentation. The other thing is that other people might have that same question. And if they don't get that question answered, it can even just be a mental distraction for them as an audience member, even if they can still comprehend and understand the content that you're sharing that came after that point. They can get a little hung up on remembering to ask you that question, or they might be a little frustrated that they didn't get their question answered. So I would recommend taking questions in context, but also being mindful of staying on task and on time as you go throughout your presentation. A really great technique when facilitating question and answers is to repeat the question for everybody to hear. And you do that as a courtesy for a couple of different reasons. One is the person asking the question, their voice was pointed at you, so your ears picked it up. Now, everybody else's ears were also pointing at you, so their ears might not have picked it up, and there's a really good chance they didn't. Then when you repeat the question into the microphone, because all the TUG Connects rooms are going to have microphones, and use those microphones, because you don't know if the room is equipped with a microphone, it means that the meeting organizer wants you to use the microphone. You have no idea if there's somebody who's got a situation, a medical situation where they have a challenge hearing, or any number of things. Sometimes conference rooms, whether they're in your corporate offices or in conference centers, can be noisy and so on. So you want to repeat that question for all to hear. That also buys you a little bit of time as you organize your answer to it. If you are giving an answer that's based on your opinion, go ahead and clarify that. And usually you don't have to clarify if your answer is based on fact, but if your answer is based on your opinion, then you want to make sure you say, in my opinion or in my experience, we've done it this way. However, your experience might vary, something like that. And if you don't have the answer, don't make something up. Just admit that you don't know that and compliment the person who asked the question by saying, that's a very interesting question, that's a great question, and I don't happen to know the answer to that. You might then ask them to come and drop their business card at the end of your presentation, and then you'll look up that information, or you'd find out the answer and get back to them. And if you are challenged, use a yes and instead of a yes but response. If somebody's asking a challenging question, kind of taking you to task on something, you say, yes, that's a great question, and here's how we've done it in my organization, instead of a yes but, because but serves to kind of shut down that question and the questioner. Yes and acknowledges that that was a good question and that it has value. And then finally, answer, not quite finally, two more. Answer succinctly. So give your responses as straightforwardly and succinctly as you can, because that's also going to help you stick to the time frame of your presentation. And then, Q&A at the end of your presentation or during your presentation. It's your choice. But again, I'm going to advocate for during, because it's really going to help those people who do have questions stay focused on the rest of your presentation. Again, you are free to type any of your questions into the question bank, and Gloria will get them to me. We have a few minutes left, and I want to share a few things to do after your presentation is complete. So they are connecting with people, following up, and then, of course, being good to yourself, congratulating yourself for a job well done. So the first thing to do after the presentation, and this is right after the presentation, connect with people. Stick around to answer questions, because that's where you're going to build more lasting relationships with people. And one of the things, too, to do during that time when you're connecting with people is find out their names. And you might ask for their business card. And if they're people from your own organization, let's say you're giving a technical presentation in the office, stick around and talk with people afterwards about what sense they made out of the presentation, what additional questions they might have, how they're going to use this information, because you really do get a chance to build relationships there. They know you because you were the presenter, so you really landed with them and made an impression on them. Hopefully you made a great impression on them, especially after putting some of these tips in place. But when you can connect with people and build relationships, they're going to remember you, and that bodes well for your career. Now, if you're at TUG Connects and you're a presenter, again, you want to connect with the people who are in your audience, because they see you as a person of authority because you were A, selected to speak, and then B, you just shared some great information with them. So connect, one of the great things about being at TUG Connects, whether you are presenting or attending the conference, either way, is you can build some amazing relationships with people who have similar issues with software as you do, people who have similar career challenges as you do, and so on. And knowing somebody at TUG Connects and building that relationship after a presentation is over means that you now have another person in your virtual Rolodex to ring up and give a quick call to when you're stuck on something or when you need somebody's advice or some good business ideas from them. So think about the technical presentation as a platform for really building relationships. And the more relationships you have, really the more influence in your career and in your field you have, because you have more people to call on to help you solve problems, and you also then become a resource for them. So it's a great way to build influence, building relationships right after the presentation. The next thing is follow up after TUG Connects or after your technical presentation. When somebody had a question or somebody engaged you afterwards, kind of hung out with you and talked with you and you got to know them, go ahead and follow up with them. Reach out to them, whether if they specifically asked a question or had something that you didn't have the answer to, by all means, follow up with them so that they can get the information from you. And even if they just had a nice, casual chat with you afterwards, go ahead and connect with them on LinkedIn or by email, just so that you have each other's contact information. And I see from Gloria there is a question. So Gloria, go ahead. What's the question?
The question is from Trevor Walker. He says, how do you like to handle questions that are not directly related to the current discussion? And have you had any success with using a parking lot, quote unquote, for questions that will take a long time to answer?
Yes. So let me answer those in turn. So I'll answer the parking lot question first. So a parking lot is a great place to put ideas or questions that aren't necessarily germane to your presentation. So for example, if somebody asks you a question that you really weren't anticipating covering, You could say, what I'd love to do with that question is put that in the parking lot for right now. And if we have time at the end of the presentation, we will come back to that. But it is out of scope for what we had planned for today. But I do want to make sure that if we have time, we'll come to any of these ideas in the parking lot. And then have a physical place to put those questions. So if you've got, if there is a whiteboard in the room or a flip chart or something like that, if you can write that question up and put it in a place where the question asker can see it, then they know that it's been captured, and it's also a good visual cue for you to come back to it. The first question, when somebody's asking a question that's not necessarily related to your planned topic, is simply to say, or if they want to go, sometimes they want to go down into the weeds and get really specific about something that maybe the rest of your audience isn't as interested in. And this is where you have to use a little bit of your intuition and spidey sense to figure out, gosh, does everybody else want to go there too, or is it just this person? And if you decide it is just this person, then what I like to do is I like to say, that's a great question. And it is, a bit more detailed than we were planning to go in this presentation. What I would love to do is, after we're done here, follow up with you, and you and I can go one-on-one, talk about that. And hey, anybody else who's interested in going deeper on that and following that thread or that train of thought, let's connect after the presentation and talk more about that. So that's how I like to handle those. Great question. And thank you for asking it, Tyler. Next, a third and final thing to do after your presentation is just really congratulate yourself on a job well done. Soak in the fact that you went out on a limb and gave that presentation, because you are putting yourself in a vulnerable situation anytime you are giving a presentation. So find some way to acknowledge yourself for the fact that you did that and you took the risk. And again, it pays off in terms of career progression. When you give a good presentation, that puts you on the radar of executives, that puts you on the radar, sometimes it puts you on the radar of your competition, and you can get recruited for a better job. Not that I'm necessarily recommending that, but when you give a good presentation and when you're routinely out there presenting, it puts you on the radar of people, and you are seen as a mover and shaker. So congratulate yourself, and do something good for yourself, and to celebrate your accomplishment of presenting. So today we covered what to do before, during, and after a presentation. We took some questions. We got another minute or two, so if anybody does have any further questions, go ahead and type those into the question bank, and Gloria will get them to me. And I will also want to mention a quick shout out to, when you are at TUG Connects, mark your calendar the day before the conference starts. So Saturday, March 7th, from 1 to 4, and that time slot might vary a little bit, but I believe it's going to be from 1 to 4. We will be talking about, I'll be giving you some advanced presentation techniques. So if you are a presenter at TUG, make your travel plans to come in on Saturday and spend the afternoon with me. We'll be doing some hot seat. We'll get a couple of people will be brave enough to share some of their slides with us and do 5 or 10 minutes of their presentation, and we'll give them some on-the-spot feedback. We'll give them some great positive feedback about what's going well. And as is my nature, I will try to find a thing or two that, without totally revamping their presentation, they can make some small tweaks to make their presentation at TUG Connects even better than what they were planning on. So I hope to see you there. It's a lot of fun. And even if you're not presenting at TUG Connects and you're going to be at the conference, you're certainly welcome to sit in on that session. All right, I also want to make sure you know how to reach me. So I've got my contact information here. Workingconversations.com is my website. I am Janelle at workingconversations.com, and you can send that with or without the hyphen, because I have both those domains, so they'll come to me either way. And my phone number is 612-327-8026. So if you have any quick questions that I can answer that will help make your technical presentation rock, I would love to answer them for you. If it's a lot of questions or a deep dive, then we'll talk about a consulting rate, but I love to answer your quick questions. And I see there is another question. So go ahead, Gloria, what's the question?
The previous question that Trevor had posed made me want to address something that, when people are giving presentations and there's another speaker behind them, say for example at TUG or another industry conference, or even if you have meeting space in your own company that's going right into another meeting after yours with, say, maybe a 15-minute break, what is the best way to connect with people, address their questions and give them ample time, and at the same time being considerate of the speaker presenter behind you, that you need to disconnect to allow them to come in and connect their computer and pull up their presentation and prepare without stress?
Great question. Yeah. So and I'll address it first at, if it's at a conference and you absolutely must get yourself out of that room so that the next presenter can come in, because usually there is a very short teardown and setup time in between sessions. Now, if it's a question that you're comfortable answering, you might be able to multitask while you are shutting down your computer and getting your equipment, packed up and out of there. But sometimes that can really slow you down to be in conversation with somebody and doing that as well. So you could just very courteously tell the person, hey, I do need to get my things out of here because there's another presenter coming in right on my heels. Wait for me in the hall and I'll be right out in a minute or two. And that way you send that person out into the hall, they're waiting for you, and then you have the freedom to just simply focus on the tasks at hand of shutting everything down and not accidentally leaving something behind in the room. Now, it also might be the case that you've just finished your presentation at a conference, TUG Connects or wherever, and you have another presentation that you desperately want to go sit in on and learn from, in which case a conference is a great time to tell the person, like, hey, I got something else that I want to run off to, and I don't want to miss valuable content that's going on right now in the next session, down the hall in a different room. So let's do this. Let's meet tomorrow at breakfast, or let's meet today at the coffee break, or let's meet, some point in the near future right there at the conference. And one of the things too that's really nice in doing is, a lot of times you go to a professional conference with a colleague or two from your company. This helps expand your network at the conference, because now you have a coffee date or you have a lunch date with somebody else who's there at the conference, and you get to know some other people a little bit better. Some of the same applies if it's at your company. And I know at companies, especially the good conference rooms, they get booked back to back to back all day long. And you do need to scoot out as quickly as possible so the next meeting can come and set up. So, again, kind of taking it out in the hall. Sometimes people use the let's take this offline metaphor, but moving that conversation quickly out of the room as possible. And then again, if it's somebody who's in your company, it's easy to say, hey, let's put some time on our calendars where we can talk about this more specifically, because I'm, running off to my next meeting, and you probably are too. But then you can, do that on the calendar. And I would also, just to put because you were the presenter, I would put the onus of doing that, setting that meeting up, on the other person. I would say, hey, I would love to talk more about this with you. I'd love to get into the nitty-gritty details. Would you please put some time on my calendar for the two of us to sit down and do it? Because especially right after you've given a presentation, you might have a dozen things floating through your head, things that you missed that you wish you would have said, things that you knew you could do better. You might be feeling great that you did the presentation. You might be full of all kinds of different emotions, and you might very easily forget to follow up with that person. So put the onus of following up on the other person, especially when it's in your own company. Great question, Gloria. Thank you. Any other questions before we wrap it up?
I don't see anything right now in the question bank, Janelle.
Okay. Well, again, if you do have any questions afterwards, or thoughts or things you want to run by me real quick, you've got my contact information there in both a phone number and an email address. I'd love to hear from you.
Janelle, thank you so much for the great content today. We look forward to seeing you at TUG in Dallas in March. And as they say in Hollywood, everyone, that's a wrap.